All right. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Heather Mertens, and I will be your presenter today. So, unfortunately, I had originally hoped to come to the conference in person, but due to some personal obligations, I couldn't be there. So, I'll be giving my presentation to you via Zoom, a recording of Zoom. So welcome to the presentation. The presentation I'll be sharing with you today is Sustaining Dialogues, Reshaping ELT Materials in a Global World. And my name is Heather. I'm currently working at Baltimore City Community College, about an hour, Washington, DC. And I originally presented this actually with a former colleague of mine when I worked in India, Shweta Khanna, who is the program manager at the US Embassy in New Delhi. So I just want to give her some credit. Of course, she couldn't be here with me today due to the time difference and everything like that, but we did originally present this presentation together. And this presentation was really inspired by two things. First of all, when I was an undergrad at the University of Illinois, I discovered linguistics. It's funny, this is a long, I don't know if you need all this history, but I originally was going to study chemistry or biology, discovered languages and how much I loved them. But when I studied linguistics, I really started getting interested in sociolinguistics, and my professors on the University of Illinois actually has done a lot of work with global Englishes, with world Englishes, with just dialects in general. And then with my time in India, really being on the ground and seeing how complex the English language is, not only in its grammar, vocabulary, etc., but also in what constitutes English. So those are two major inspirations for the presentation you'll be seeing here. So I want to start with just some background, just some pictures here of my time in India. On the left is a picture of a teacher training program I gave, and on the right is a picture of some of the students I had. And the reason I'm showing you to this is just to kind of promote the English language program. This presentation is not sponsored by them, but I think it's a wonderful opportunity. If you are currently looking for an opportunity to work internationally to gain some experience and you have a master's degree in TESOL, this is an awesome program that you might consider working with. So the questions we're going to address in this session are really three. And I have to say this session is more food for thought. There aren't necessarily clear solutions at the moment, at least in my opinion, of what we need to do. But I want you to start thinking about this topic and really what can be done. So in a global world, is there a standard variety of English? So we often use this idea of standard English. What does that actually mean? To what degree, if any, should Braj Kachru's theory of world Englishes influence this definition? And that is a model I'll be talking about in this presentation. And in light of these questions, to what degree, if any, should English language teaching materials be reshaped, especially in outer circle countries? And I'll talk about what this means in just a few minutes. So we really want to think about what is English, where is English being used, and are the materials we're using serving the students that we have for the English they need? So just to kind of get us thinking about this topic, traditionally when we talk about English, we often think about countries like the US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the UK, of course. But if you look at the map here, it's actually much more complicated than what we often think of as English. Parts of Africa, Asia, even parts of South America and Central America, they have English as an official language. So when we think about English, we really need to broaden our ideas of what English means, what English is. And of course, in this presentation, because I have the most experience in India, I'll be talking about Indian English, and really just not necessarily what Indian English is, but how we can think about how materials can be used in a country like India. And the model here is really the model I previously mentioned, is that we have three kind of circles of where English is used. One starts with the inner circle, countries we usually think of as being where English is spoken. These are the types of Englishes we usually teach in our classrooms, like the US, Canada, New Zealand. But it's much more complicated than that. There are actually many countries like India and Nigeria where English is widely used on a day-to-day basis, and the English used might not be what we think of English as. And we won't get into this too much in this presentation, but there's also another discussion that could be had about the expanding circle. These are countries where English is not an official language, where there really aren't native speakers of English, but English is a global language and it's being taught in schools. So today we're going to focus more on the outer circle, this idea of countries where English is an official language. It's a language of often the law, of government, maybe of education. It's not necessarily the native language of most of the people in the country, but it's actually pretty complicated because it depends on the country. I don't want to make generalizations, but it is widely used for government and official purposes. So just kind of thinking about what English is again. In the countries we usually think of as English, there are 325 million speakers. But another thing you might want to kind of food for thought here, there's actually more speakers of English in countries with it as an official language. And of course, globally, it's even more than that. So just kind of, I want to talk about the man, honor the man who came up with this theory, originally from India. He challenged historical notions of what should be classified as standard English. He was very groundbreaking in saying, this idea of what English is isn't quite correct. Argued that non-native varieties of English were also rule-governed systems and should not be seen as erroneous approximations of standard English. So of course, the history is quite sad in some sense, and I think even to a certain extent this happens today, that American or British English are often seen as the standards of correct English. But his argument, and I think it's quite true, I strongly agree with it, is that the English spoken in India, Nigeria, many countries around the world, it's not deviations, it's not something that's wrong. It's actually a variety in and of itself. And he was the first to really coin the term World English. It's not working. Okay, so I kind of talked about this already. I don't think I'm going to read everything on this slide. I just want to review it briefly before we delve into more of the content. But keep in mind that the inner circle, it's where English is the native tongue of almost everyone. So if you think about the US, the UK, Canada, etc., of course, there are exceptions, but almost every person in that country speaks English natively. It's their first language. Outer circle, a large part of this is colonization. English is not the native tongue of most of the people, but it serves an official role, like I already talked about. It might be the language of the government, of education. And expanding circle, countries like China, Japan, Mexico, etc. We can make a long list, many countries. English has no historical or government role, but it's still seen as an important language. So let's start to try to think about, start to brainstorm what English is. So I'm going to start with two examples that might be more familiar. These are more from American English, but if we think about what this is called. So give you a second, think in your mind, what do you call this? What is the name of this? Okay, before I show you the answer, I'm going to say what I would think. So I grew up in Southern Illinois, close to the St. Louis metropolitan region. I'm basically from St. Louis. I mean, people from St. Louis might disagree, but the language spoken there is from that region, not Chicago. So I would call this a sub sandwich, okay? But as you see on this slide, there are many different words for it, right? Oops, went too fast. Hoagie, submarine, grinder, hero, po' boy. So even within the US, we often can't agree about what something is called. Let me give you another example. So take a minute to think about, what do you call this beverage? Okay, I hope you had some time to think about it. So what I grew up saying was soda. But of course, as many of you know, there are many words for it. Soda pop, soft drink, tonic. We have many ways to talk about this beverage. But what we're going to talk about here, so I just wanted to give you 2 examples from American English to get you brainstorming, to get you thinking about how even within this country language can vary. But I want to switch gears a bit to talk about a context with which you may or may not be familiar. We're going to talk mostly about India because, like I said, that's where I have the most experience. But before we talk about that, I wanted to introduce you to a term, nativization. So this term is really, in the absence of native speakers, for example, after colonization, what happens to the language? So we know countries like India were colonized by the British, but once the British left, what happened to the language? Whose language is it? So we want to think about this when we look at pictures like this. So this is actually an image from the Times of India, which is it's kind of like the New York Times in India. It's a very widely used newspaper. It's proofread. The stories are usually of very high quality. So you see this picture here, no mask, no ration. Now, of course, my gut feeling when I see this is to correct it, to say, wait, ration? What do you mean by ration? That sounds kind of strange. Do you mean no mask, no service? Do you mean no mask, no purchase? And I think our gut instinct, if we had a student we were working with, would be to correct this. And perhaps if we were training them for academic writing or for communication in the US, that would be valid. But if we think about nativization within India, this might actually not be an error, excuse me. This is a shopkeeper in India. He's putting up a sign on his store. This was in a government newspaper. So clearly the person who wrote the story didn't see it as an error. So you might kind of think about this when looking at the English, especially if you work abroad. Is this a mistake? What's happening in the local community? Let me show you another example. So toilets way. Again, my gut feeling is, whoa, toilets way? What? Do you mean like the way to the restroom? The way to the bathroom? What are you trying to communicate? But of course, both of these pictures are actual pictures in India, people using the language. It's a language widely used. So these aren't necessarily deviations, these are different usages. And if you're in India, you'll see many, many examples of this. And when I worked there, I was very much challenged to think to myself about what language I was teaching. What is English and what does it mean for my students? And there was a lot of learning to be had. And these are just some more examples. I wanted to put these, this slide actually, I have to admit, was originally created by my colleague Shweta, who is a native Indian English speaker. And she made a list for me of some examples of some terms in India, which to a native speaker of American, British English, maybe the countries in the inner circle, we might not know what these are. And some of these I actually did have to challenge myself to learn while I was in India. So for example, number 3, when I first went to India, people kept saying geyser. I was like, what is geyser? What are you talking about? But it's an electric water heater. And this is the term used in the country. It's not a mistake. Graduation, 3 to 4, 5-year undergrad program. Homely, number 5, very different meaning from what I had thought. I thought homely meant someone who was bland, who was not good, not attractive. But in India, it's a completely different meaning. It means someone, it's actually in wedding advertisements. If someone's looking for a spouse or a partner, you might be looking for a homely woman. It's someone who's good at household tasks, who would be a good wife. So again, this idea that we really want to think of what context we're teaching in. And when I was in India, I really had to think, what is the language being used? What vocabulary do my students need? Is it different from what I had thought? And factors leading to this really are colonization, one, but this idea after the colonizers leave. So one is transliteration. So in India, what you see, and in many outer circle countries, is kind of languages coming together. So you might see movie covers like this, where the language is a mixture of Hindi and English, but it's written not in the traditional Hindi writing style, but the English script. Also, Facebook, social media is playing a huge role. If you look at Facebook, most of the language used is American English, some degree British English, but some of it is really a mixture of Hindi and English coming together. It's not, in India, they have like this term Hinglish, this idea that, you know, it's not quite English, it's not quite Hindi, and that causes some differences in the language. And the slide here is just a little bit more background about how it can be complicated as well, because there's so many factors going on. There are people who speak English as their first language, as their second language, third, fourth, fifth. And people also sometimes disagree as to how many native speakers there are or how many fluent speakers there are. So if you look at the bottom, this is some data again from my colleague who showed me. She put this slide together for us when we originally presented this, that there's a working population who claims, so they might read English, about 16%, but they speak English more. And also on the right side, you can really see one strange thing about English in India is it is used at the university level. You need to have some understanding of English. Most of the classes are taught in English. At many universities, all of the education is in English at the university, but the students aren't necessarily proficient. So the purpose of this slide is to really point out this idea that while there is a huge mixture, there's a lot of English going on. At the same time, there is a huge, huge need for students to learn English, to improve their English, because one of the huge barriers to advancement in outer circle countries like India is that students might not be able to finish their degree programs or get good job opportunities because they're not speaking enough English. So it is, again, a little bit crazy because the estimates vary. And I think the problem is just a disagreement with measurement. In India, some people say 1% of the population speaks English. And I think this would mean like fluently, naturally. Some say 35%. And 10.4% of the country's population, roughly 130 million citizens, identify English as their second or third language. Hindi is, of course, the dominant language. But one thing we haven't mentioned yet is that in many parts of India, there's other languages too. Like if you go to Tamil Nadu in southern India, actually there's not a lot of Hindi spoken. There's a strong pride with the Tamil language. So there's a lot of different factors happening. So the key trends, so just kind of trying to talk before we look at the materials, I want to give a bit of an understanding of why English is still needed. So you might be asking yourself, okay, what's really the purpose of this presentation, reshaping materials? You know, there's a different language used, but I want to point to the problem that English is still needed. There is a need, a great need for improvement in English language education, because many students, the key drivers towards using more English are demand in higher education, English medium schooling. A lot of the education is in English. Most good jobs in India requires English proficiency. And it is viewed as a means to social and geographic mobility. And another thing too, it's kind of a shared language because there's so many regional languages in India. English is seen kind of like, not by everyone, I mean, there is disagreement, but as a neutral language, a language that can be used because it's not really tied to one community, one ethnic minority or majority. Again, just kind of going into this in a little bit more detail, young adults, unfortunately, and this was a lot of the work I did where students were not prepared. I would work with students who didn't speak any English or very little English, and they were actually English majors. They were trying to get a degree in English. And another problem too is English teachers in government schools and Indian universities have limited proficiency. So on top of the students not really knowing English properly, you also have this problem where instructors might not always know the language, but at the same time, if you want to get the opportunities in society, you really need English. So an application of this presentation is also to think about people in these countries need English, but the English that is often taught in textbooks or in materials isn't necessarily the English that they need for their context. So the paradox that's really happening is we have these countries where English is the official language of government, of school. It's the language of opportunity, of advancement. But at the same time, many people within I have a lot of experience with India. I won't speak to all of the outer circle countries, but I think many of them have the same issue, is that people need English, right? They don't really know it to the degree which they need for advancement. But at the same time, the industry creating materials is churning out materials that draw on standard British or standard American English. And some scholars have argued that these norms are less appropriate in many new English contexts, countries like India, Nigeria, the Philippines, since the aim of speakers in these territories is to communicate with L2 speakers of English rather than L1 English speakers. And this is really what I struggled with, is I know American English. The textbooks I was given, many materials I was given were in American English, but my students weren't going to go to the States. They weren't going abroad to learn English. They needed English in their country. So what I want to do now is some application. And I know that unfortunately, because I can't be physically at the conference, you won't be able to do this in small groups. But I'm going to kind of show you some textbook pages. I want you to try to apply this and think about what materials are and how they can be used. And the question really is review the following textbook pages. To what degree can they serve students in outer circle countries? So to what degree can they serve students in outer circle countries? So let's take a look. And I intentionally am not going to show you where these pages come from, because I don't want you to know the textbook, because I don't think this problem is limited to one specific textbook series. I think this is a global issue. Many textbooks, some are better than others, but many textbooks have similar problems. So let's take a look at this page. So let's see if I can actually, let me try to make this a little bit bigger. So I want you to take a few moments, I hope everyone can see it, to just kind of scan, starting with number 3. So we'll start from this part of the page, scan the page. I'll give you a minute or so to think about this page. And to what degree, if any, this might be useful for outer circle countries. So go ahead and look over the page. Let me give you some time. Okay. So I hope you had some time to look through this. So let's think about this together. So one thing that comes to my mind, and this is something that I have had pointed out to me, is the premise of the conversation about camping. Is this something that your students are doing? Is this even an activity that people do in the country in which you're teaching? So depending on the outer circle country, this may or may not be an activity that is done. To me, this seems like a very traditional, like American thing to do. Another problem that you might see is, so maybe the cultural focus of the conversation isn't relevant. The idea of the park, Big Lake Park. Are there lakes where your students are? Is this something they're familiar with? To dig a little bit deeper, and again, these are questions you would want to think about, is even this whole interaction, asking for and giving advice. So this is something that might, if we're doing a conversation in the US, this might be a relevant thing if someone's learning how to talk to a friend, ask for and give advice. Although I would critique this, and it's too limited to should. I think it could be more communicative and giving more options. But indirect rejection, is this something that is done? Is the way that we give advice, directness and indirectness, is directness and indirectness the same in the culture in which you're teaching? So this textbook page could be problematic in many ways if you're in an outer circle country. One, camping. Is this something your students can relate to? Is this something familiar? Advice giving. Is this something that students even, of course, in every culture you can give advice. Now that I say that, maybe that's not necessarily true, but in most cultures, there's a way of giving advice. But is the way to give advice the same? So not only is the content maybe not relevant, but also just the conversational style. Let's look at another example. So this example, I want to briefly talk about, and this is something that I haven't mentioned so far, but another issue I see in many textbooks, although I have to admit it's gotten better in recent years, is diversity. So if you look, and this is actually something, if you haven't watched the TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, I highly recommend it, is you'll notice a lot of pictures of white people doing American things, like making spaghetti. If you look at this picture here, not only maybe the characters, they don't look like your students, but two, will they know what spaghetti is? In a global world, maybe, but the things being cooked in the textbook might not be what your students know, okay? I want to show you more examples. So let me zoom out a bit here. So I'll give you maybe 30 seconds to look over this. What might be the problem? Okay. So I hope it's two things are clear to you. One, the pictures, the activities being done. These may or may not be things that your students are doing. The way the phrases are constructed, are these things called the same thing, like whitewater rafting? Is whitewater, are these terms in the country in which you're teaching? Three, if you want to even take it a step further, of course, this might be hard to swallow, but are the forms being used most dangerous, easiest? This idea of how we structure grammar, comparatives and superlatives. You might really think about the speakers around you in the country in which you're teaching and think, are these grammar structures being used? So one thing I often see a lot, and I saw this a lot with articles, because in Indian English, articles are not used in the same way they're used in American English. Is the grammar being taught in the textbook the same grammar that's actually being used in this country? So I think most textbooks really strongly focus on traditional grammar rules, on American and British English, but you might take a minute to kind of carefully think about the grammar you're teaching and whether it's the grammar that your students, if the grammar is actually used the same in that country. Okay. I just wanted to give, there's many examples. Again, I'm not going to pick on the textbook that I'm showing you here, but even thinking about things like, does this look fun to you? Why or why not? Is this an image where, is this something that your students can relate to? Hiking, do they know what hiking is? Have they been hiking? Do they have the opportunity to do this? And then also just the pictures here. I mean, you can see a lot of the images of people in uniform, like police, firefighter. These are pictures of maybe what an American person might wear if they're a police person or a fireman. So these might not be the images that your students see in their country. An American style house, lifeguard, is this what your students would see? Another problem too, are these job titles called the same thing? Do they say police or do they say something else? Do they say firefighter, lifeguard, child at beach? Is lifeguard the same word? Pretending what to be when you grow up. Is this something even done in the country, in the culture? Are children asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? Because if they're not asked, this might not be something your students can relate to, etc. Okay. So I hope that you can kind of see from these textbook pages how they might be problematic if you're teaching a country like India, Nigeria, etc. How some of the cultural references, the language being used might not be relatable. So let's head back to the presentation and let's talk about what we can do. So this isn't to say that English materials that are published are useless. We don't want to just throw them out the window. Of course, as teachers, I think in an ideal world, we would create everything from scratch, at least for me. If I were paid amazingly well and I had all the time in the world, I would just make my own materials. But we often do recognize, and when I was teaching in India, to be frank, I had so much to do. I didn't have the time to make everything from scratch, but you might adapt your materials. Things I would do is I might, cross out names of students like John, Peter, Mary. These might not be names students are familiar with. Concepts like camping. If I had a dialogue or a grammar page in a textbook and they didn't know what camping is, I might need to replace that with an activity that students actually do. Things like making toast, making spaghetti. You might think about, are these dishes your students are making? So really expanding it to carefully analyze the materials you're using and thinking about, what is this? Are these concepts in this culture, or does anything need to be changed? So just kind of some questions to consider if you're teaching in an outer circle country, is where will your students be using English? What English do they need? What English is being used? Is it professional English? Is it street English? Is it something else? Whose stories are being told? And this is a question that I think we need to talk about even more is, who is in the textbook? Are they Americans? Are they British people? Are they white? Are they Black? Are they brown? Who is represented in your textbook? And are the characters in the textbook characters that your students can relate to? And really, most importantly, does the textbook meet these goals? If not, and not just the textbook, the worksheets, everything you make, how can you bridge the gap? What can you do? So I told you what I would do. I mean, it did take a lot of time and energy, but I needed to serve my students is I would actually adapt the materials or create my own materials. So my students had cultural references, words and phrases they knew. And you really want to think about, I think the primary purpose of this presentation, I mean, my largest call to action is to call upon the industry and to think about maybe I think if you look at nearly every textbook I know of, I think with diversity, things are improving. But when it comes to thinking about different types of English, there aren't a lot of materials out there. So I think the industry really could do better at reshaping materials, really thinking about what English is being taught and is it serving students throughout the world? I'm really thinking about these ideas. Is this the curriculum? Is this a guide, or is this a resource? And I would argue more for the last option, is that this is a resource. This isn't something that we want to take. I mean, I don't think any teacher takes the textbook as a Bible. If you're a good teacher, you know, hey, this textbook has problems, it has mistakes, so I'll work with it. But you might want to really carefully think about the content, especially if you're teaching abroad. Other applications that weren't part of this presentation, but I think this is something that maybe could be done in other presentations and other research, is to think about things like economic, region, and race. And this is something I've recently been thinking about, and I might even try to create a presentation about this, is a lot of the students I'm working with at Baltimore City Community College, they might not need the proper grammar being taught. Not everything. I mean, I don't want to create a broad brush, but the grammar that they're using on the street isn't the grammar in the textbook. So whose language is being taught? Is this the English of standard American English on TV and movies? This idea of the traditional like Eurocentric English that we're supposed to be learning to say, don't say ain't, make sure you say whom, use all of these forms that are thought of as correct English, but might not be representative of the complexities on the street. Whose stories are being told? Is this a traditional upper middle class white English, or is it something else? And do these match the purposes for which your students need English? We really, I think one takeaway I hope from this presentation is to really carefully think about who your students are and what English they're using. And is the English you're teaching matching the context in which they're using it? All right, so I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I hope it gave you something to think about. These are my references. And if you have any questions, you feel free to reach out to me via email. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and I hope to see you around in person again one day. Bye.